My name is Donna, 69 years old, a widow living in Vermont. I was a nurse for nearly 40 years and used to believe that if I loved enough, sacrificed enough, then family would always cherish that. But right after my husband's funeral, my son, Matthew, looked me straight in the eye and said, "You're just extra now. Get out of the house." Then he slapped me. It wasn't a slip of the hand. It was a slap of rejection from someone who no longer saw his mother as family. I stood there, beside a casket that hadn't even been closed yet, being thrown out by the very son I had spent my whole life building this home for. Have you ever been turned into a stranger by the very people you loved the most? Inside the home you once called your safe place? If you've ever felt betrayed by someone you loved more than yourself, leave a comment. Tap like if you believe that a mother's silence can sometimes be her greatest strength. And hit subscribe to hear the rest of the story they thought I would never dare to tell. Because the moment they thought they had won, I opened the safe. I was born and raised in a small Vermont town, where winter stretched into April and spring felt more like a hopeful whisper than a promise. My family didn't have much, but my mother taught me that as long as you had your hands and a kind heart, you were never worthless. I became a nurse not out of ambition, but because I wanted to be the person sitting bedside, holding someone's hand in their most vulnerable moment. I did that job for almost 40 years. I stayed up through snowstorms, wiping sweat from sick foreheads, sat beside patients whose families never came, and walked home in uniforms soaked with tears and legs numb from standing. But I never complained. I loved that work. It made me feel useful. It gave me worth. Greg, my husband, used to be a mechanic before he opened a small garage. The early years of our marriage were tough. Some months we could barely afford the bills and lived on peanut butter sandwiches for a week. But every night, Greg would hold me close and say, "Tomorrow's going to be better." I believed him. I always did. Things started to look up when Matthew was born. I worked night shifts at the hospital while Greg took him to school every morning. That's how we rotated for nearly 2 decades. Then Greg poured all our savings into a lakeside inn project with an old friend. The project collapsed, his friend disappeared, and we lost nearly everything. Greg spiraled. At the time, we were renting. When the bank denied Greg a mortgage due to poor credit, I stepped in and co-signed the home loan for this house. I filled out every line on those mortgage papers. I met with the broker, sorted the taxes, and hired the transfer attorney. I remember the day we signed the contract. Greg's hands were shaking so badly, the ink blurred on the page. I placed my hand on his shoulder and whispered, "It's okay. I'll keep us steady." That house wasn't big, but it was built from months and years of scraping together every dime. Every time I patched a roof leak, painted the walls, or planted a new flower bed out front, I silently thanked myself for never giving up. Matthew grew up a good kid. Back in middle school, he was bullied for wearing glasses and reading history books. I went to the school myself, confronted the principal, and demanded they revise their disciplinary approach. I even signed up as a volunteer in the school library so he wouldn't feel alone. I loved him with no conditions. When he went to college, I took extra shifts at the hospital, even worked private night care to help cover tuition. I remember one year, Matthew said he wanted to open a small restaurant, his dream since culinary school. Greg wasn't on board. But I secretly sold my white gold wedding earrings Greg had given me and handed Matthew his startup money. I lied and told them it was a year-end bonus. Greg never knew. Matthew hugged me tight and said, "I won't let you down, Mom." I believed him. Matthew's restaurant became successful pretty quickly. It got featured in the local paper, customers lined up, and he even opened a second branch. I was proud. I started to think, maybe my sacrifices were finally paying off. Then he met Haley. Haley was young, polished, charming, very good at first impressions. The first time we met, she hugged me tightly and called me Mama Donna. I truly wanted to believe this would be a good mother-in-law, daughter-in-law relationship, I hoped too soon. After Haley moved in, I slowly started to feel like the house wasn't mine anymore. She changed the curtains, redid the kitchen tile, moved Greg's memorial shelf, calling it energy realignment for the living space. I swallowed my discomfort to keep the peace. But then came the little comments that cut deeper over time. One evening while I was making dinner, Haley walked in, looked at me and said, "You should let us handle things. You need to rest. No need to be in the kitchen at your age." I smiled, but my chest tightened. Another time, I placed a flower vase in the living room like I always did. Haley quietly tucked it away in the cabinet and whispered to Matthew, thinking I couldn't hear, "I can't stand how this place feels like a nursing home." I said nothing, not because I had nothing to say, but because I feared if I spoke up, Matthew would be annoyed. I had once been the nurse who ran trauma rooms in midnight snowstorms, but in front of my son and his wife, I felt smaller than ever. Haley started controlling family meals. I wasn't allowed to buy groceries on my own. I couldn't use the laundry room after 8 p.m. because the dryer noise disturbed their sleep. She cleared out my bookcase, packed my novels into boxes, and moved them to the attic. When I asked why, she said flatly, "Paperbacks gather dust, Mom. It's not good for indoor air quality." I started sleeping less, not from age, but because every morning I woke up wondering, am I still the homeowner or just a boarder who happens to be on the lease? And Matthew? He said nothing, didn't defend me, didn't check in, didn't even notice. When I gently asked, "Can I keep a few books in the living room?" he just glanced at Haley and replied, "Mom, we're just trying to modernize the space a little. Hope you understand." That wasn't the first time I felt alone in my own home, but I never imagined it would go as far as him slapping me and throwing me out right after the funeral of the man I had held hands with for nearly 50 years. Maybe the cracks had started long ago. I had just loved too deeply to see them and stayed too quiet to stop them. I still remembered that night when Greg called me into the bedroom. The soft amber lamplight fell across the bed where he'd spent the past month sick. Greg looked thinner, but his eyes were bright. I sat on the edge, reaching for his trembling hand. "Donna," he whispered, his voice raspy but clear. "Open the nightstand drawer." I slid it open and found a sealed brown envelope. No name on it, just a handwritten line. "Open only when absolutely necessary." I looked up, concern written all over me. "Greg, what is this?" He squeezed my hand gently. "If everything stays peaceful, you'll never need it. But if Matthew turns into someone I can't recognize anymore, open it." I hesitated. "Why are you saying this? I don't understand." Greg stayed silent a while. Then he looked at me for a long time and said, "I know you always choose silence. You always carry the weight so nothing breaks, but I won't be here to protect you much longer. And I can't bear the thought of you being pushed out of the very house you built with your hands." I felt my throat tighten. I could only nod. "I understand." Greg smiled, weak but gentle. "I've arranged a few things. Everything's in a safe deposit box, under your name. Clara Evans, my attorney, knows everything. Just contact her if the time ever comes. There's also a video. I asked Clara to record a supplemental will." My heart clenched. "Greg, you didn't have to go this far." "Yes, I did." His tone was calm, but firm. "I once believed Matthew would always be good, but there are changes I can't explain anymore. It's not just Haley I don't trust. I have my reasons." My brows furrowed. "What reason?" Greg hesitated for a moment, then spoke softly. "Wyatt." I was stunned. Wyatt Martin? He was sued for money laundering and defrauding investors. "Yes," Greg nodded. "I once accidentally saw Haley texting someone named Wyatt. I remembered the name because he was the one who caused my friend's business to collapse. Haley deleted the message the moment she saw me nearby." But that's when I started to get suspicious. I stayed silent, feeling the blood vessels in my head pulsing hard. "Do you have any proof?" "Not yet," Greg sighed. "But Clara knows. I told her everything. If Haley has any ties to Wyatt, Clara will help you uncover it. I don't want this house, everything we built, to fall into the hands of people who don't deserve it." I sat there, holding Greg's hand, listening to the faint hum of the heater by the window, the ache and coldness flooding my chest. I never imagined Greg would need to prepare a protection plan for me. But now, hearing his words, I understood. He didn't do it because he doubted Matthew. He did it because he knew I always put others before myself, even when they didn't deserve it. "I promise," I whispered. "I'll only open it if I really need to." Greg closed his eyes, his hand still in mine. "I know you'll do what's right." 5 days later, he left this world. The funeral was cold and simple. Old friends came, former colleagues of mine came. But Matthew barely said a word, and Haley cried so much that I couldn't tell whether it was real or just noise to cover something else. I didn't open the envelope that day. I simply slipped it into my coat pocket, right next to my wallet, as if keeping it close would help me hold on to a part of Greg. Not until the day I was kicked out did I touch it again. That night, in a musty motel room dimly lit with the sharp smell of bleach hanging in the air, I sat on the bed and opened the envelope with trembling hands. Inside was a thin sheet of paper and a small key. The paper contained just a few lines. "This is the key to the safety deposit box at Glenbrook Bank. Clara has all the details. Inside, there's a video, an updated will, and documents of ownership. If you're reading this, it means you need them now. And Donna, I believe in you." I gripped the paper tightly, afraid to cry, afraid to let go. I remembered the look Greg gave me that night, filled with worry but also trust. I couldn't protect him from illness, but maybe I could still protect myself. Not through anger, but with what Greg left behind. Quiet preparation. The next morning, I walked into the Glenbrook Bank branch with the tiny key resting quietly in my coat pocket. I wasn't shaking. I didn't hesitate. The receptionist's expression changed the moment she saw me. "Good morning, Mrs. Carter. Mr. Gregg left instructions. I'll take you to the private room." I was led into a small, softly lit room with no noise. The banker handed me the safety deposit box. I opened it. Inside were a USB drive, a signed copy of Greg's will, and a thick stack of documents neatly clipped together. The USB had a label on it. "Watch this first." I plugged the USB into the laptop and hit play. The screen lit up with Greglack, not sick Greg, but the Greg with a gentle smile and warm voice. The video was recorded in the lawyer's office. "If you're watching this, Donna," he began, "then Matthew is no longer the man we once knew. And I'm sorry. I know you didn't want to get to this point, but if you're here, it means you had no other choice." Greg held a piece of paper in his hand and lifted it toward the camera. "This is the updated will. Clara has notarized it. If Matthew insults, drives away, or does anything to push you out of that house, his inheritance rights are voided. All assets will go into a trust under your sole control. You won't need anyone's permission." He paused, staring directly into the lens. "You are not invisible, Donna. You're the one who held this family together, and if anyone forgets that, I want them to be reminded." I paused the video. My hand still rested on the mouse, but my heart was racing. I knew I had everything I needed, not because I wanted a fight, but because Greg, the man who understood me better than anyone in the world, refused to let me be pushed aside again. I left the bank as dusk settled. On the mountain ridge, snow began to fall like salt dusting the silver-gray sky. I pulled my coat collar up and walked slowly toward the small bus parked beside the gas station. In my hand was a worn cloth bag holding the little black USB Greg left, and the hefty documents I'd quietly clutched all the way. I rented a room in a roadside lodge nestled deep in the pine forest, where phone signal was so weak that each call required standing by a precise corner of the window just to connect. The room was tiny, paneled with aged wooden boards, a single bed with a gray fleece blanket, a warped wooden table, and an old fireplace crackling all night. But at least there no one yelled at me for being a burden. I plugged the USB into my laptop. The screen displayed folders Greg had meticulously arranged by year: mortgage, title deeds, updated will, video recording. Every file was clearly labeled with specific dates and scans of notarized legal documents. I opened the recording folder. The video showed Greg sitting at the law office, serious-faced, voice steady and low, though it held a trace of weariness. I, Gregory W. Carter, in sound mind, confirmed this amendment as my lawful intent. I listened silently as he read through each line, my eyes resting on the section he emphasized. If my wife, Donna Carter, is subject to physical abuse, verbal insults, or is forced to leave the home, all inheritance rights of my son shall be immediately revoked. I paused the video again. My eyes were dry, but my hand still gripped the mouse, afraid to let go, afraid of losing the strength I had just begun to reclaim. I opened another file, audio from the body camera Greg had given me as a birthday gift. He'd said, "In case you ever need to record my cooking instructions." Turns out it recorded something I didn't want to remember, but had to keep. I heard Matthew yelling, "You're just in the way. This isn't your house anymore. Get out!" Then the harsh sound of a slap. I could hear my own breath catch, and the door slam like a knife straight into my chest. I took a deep breath, adjusted the scarf around my neck, and clicked send on the email. To Clara Evans, Law Office. Subject: Activation of Protection Clause, Greg W. Carter. Attachments: will video, scanned house documents, recording of verbal and physical abuse, ID card, marriage certificate. I typed one last line in the body of the message. Clara, if you're reading this email, it means I had no other choice. Just 1 minute after I hit send, the phone in my coat pocket buzzed. The signal was weak, but strong enough to connect the call. My heart pounded. Donna, Clara's voice came through, clear and calm. I received everything, and I want you to know, you did the right thing. I didn't say a word. I just listened to the wind howling outside the window and the steady breathing of the woman on the other end of the line. Greg anticipated everything very clearly, Clara continued. Your documents are complete, legal, and the recording is crystal clear. I can begin sending notifications today to the notary office and the bank to activate Clause 3.7 in the amended will. I sat in silence for a moment before I spoke. Clara, I didn't think I'd ever have to use it. I didn't think Matthew would. No one expects family to become strangers, Clara gently interrupted. But Greg didn't do this out of distrust. He did it out of love. He didn't want you to endure a single day of pain after he was gone. I nodded slightly, even though Clara couldn't see it. I just wanted to protect a piece of Greg. And a piece of myself, too. I understand, Clara replied. I'll draft the asset freeze notice by this afternoon. As for the house, Greg moved it into a trust under your name last year, but he hadn't filed full control yet. Now's the time. I bowed my head, closed my eyes, and felt a little lighter. I wasn't angry. I didn't want revenge. But I wanted to make sure I wouldn't be buried beneath a silence others mistook for consent. And about Haley, I hesitated. I've already got someone looking into her financial ties to Wyatt Martin. I think Greg was right to be suspicious, Clara said. If there's any sign of fraud or money laundering, we'll forward it to the state's financial crimes unit. I let out a long breath, part disbelief, part exhaustion. So Greg did more than I ever realized. Clara spoke softly. Donna, your husband was a good man, and you are the woman he trusted completely. Let me and the law handle the rest. I hung up the call and set the phone on the table, my chest swirling with emotions I couldn't name. The room was still quiet, only the sound of wind brushing against the wooden walls and the fireplace crackling like a steady heartbeat. I stood up and pulled back the thin curtain to look outside. Snow blanketed the porch in white. On the foggy window pane, I traced a gentle curve with my finger, like a silent letter, G. Greg had done what I had never dared imagine. He had spoken up for me when I was still hesitating, and now it was time for me to use my own voice, to reclaim the justice long buried in silence. 3 days after Clara sent the official notice to the bank, I received the first message from Matthew since the day I was thrown out of the house. It was short, without greeting, not even a question mark. Did you do something to the house? Got a weird notice from the bank? I didn't reply. That afternoon, I called Clara to confirm. She told me the Glenbrook Bank had completed the transfer of property ownership into the trust under my name, just as Greg's amended will instructed. Any payments, loans, or changes after that point would now require my signature. And, Clara added, they had sent a formal notice to the house's address, along with an account statement showing that Matthew's secondary credit card had been deactivated, as he no longer qualified for joint property collateral. I imagined Matthew's face when he found out his card didn't work. Maybe it happened at a grocery store while checking out a cart full of groceries. Or maybe at a dinner meeting, offering the card to the waiter and seeing it declined. He always hated embarrassment. Always had. That night, as I brewed a pot of peppermint tea, my phone buzzed. The screen showed the name I had once saved with all the love in the world, Matthew, my boy. Now, it just looked like a faded memory. I didn't pick up. Less than 5 minutes later came another call, this time from Haley. I answered. Not because I wanted to hear her, but because I needed to face her. Donna, her voice was cold as steel. I don't know what you're scheming, but if you think you can just rearrange the family's assets without consequences, you're wrong. I said nothing, just sat by the window and watched the snow outside slowly melting under the warm porch light. Haley went on. I know you're the one holding the deed, but we live in that house too. We've invested in it, renovated every brick. That house is shared. If you try anything, you'll regret it. You don't want to become the enemy in your own family. I chuckled softly, not out of spite, but because the words sounded both childish and cruel. I opened my laptop, pulled up the folder Greg had left me. With just a few clicks, I attached the scanned copy of the most important clause in the amended will. A page with Greg's signature, notarized seal, and one line highlighted in bold red ink. If my son, Matthew Carter, has ever committed physical violence, verbal abuse, or forced my wife, Donna Carter, out of the home we co-owned, all inheritance rights and real estate assets will be immediately revoked. No exceptions. I hit send, addressed to Haley Carter at. 3 minutes later, the phone rang again. Haley. I didn't answer. An hour after that, a message from Matthew. No longer demanding. Begging. Mom, I don't know what's going on. Haley says you're just upset and overreacting. Can we meet and talk, please? I read it. I didn't reply. The next morning, Clara called me from her law office. Donna, I just received an email from the attorneys representing Matthew and Haley. They're asking if there's any chance to renegotiate the property agreement terms. I laughed. So, they want to bargain for the rights I already secured? Legally, they don't stand a chance, Clara stated firmly. Greg's clause is airtight, and with your audio recording, plus Haley's threatening messages and emails, I'd say if this went to court, they'd only dig a deeper hole. I sat silently, then said, I don't want to sue them. I just want them to understand. I'm no longer the quiet shadow in that house. You don't have to sue, Clara softened. You just have to hold your ground. The bank has frozen all transactions. Matthew's card is deactivated. Their secondary credit card charges are now in collections. And they can't treat the house like it's theirs anymore. I glanced at the tea table where Greg used to sit every morning with the newspaper in hand, steam rising from his coffee. I nodded slowly. Clara, I don't need compensation. I just need them to realize that house didn't fall from the sky. I'll draft the response letter in that spirit, Clara replied. And I'll attach a copy of Greg's signed clause again. After hanging up, I reopened the recording file. I didn't need to hear it again, but I wanted to reassure myself that I wasn't dreaming. Greg had truly seen it all coming, and I hadn't let him down. I wrapped the wool scarf Greg had bought on our last trip to Boston around my neck and stepped out onto the porch. Snow blanketed the forest in soft white. Morning light gilded the bare branches like gold leaf. The small house I was staying in wasn't luxurious, but it had one thing the other house no longer did. Choice. Mine. I no longer needed to prove anything, but I would still see this through. Not out of vengeance, but so they, each of them, would remember that I was once silent, but never powerless. I arrived late on purpose. The family meeting was arranged by Clara at a small conference room in her law office. Neutral ground, with just enough seriousness in the air to make sure no one could keep pretending anymore. I walked in when everyone was already seated. Matthew sat at the head of the table, his face hollowed, hands clenched together. Haley sat next to him, dressed properly, but her lips were tight and her eyes kept darting toward the door. I didn't greet anyone. I simply placed my folder on the table, sat at the empty seat at the end, and gave Clara a small nod. Clara stood, carefully opened the folder in front of her, and began speaking in a calm, precise voice. Thank you all for arriving on time. Today, per the legal request of Mrs. Donna Carter, and in accordance with both the original will and its addendum from Mr. Gregory Carter, we will proceed with a reaffirmation of inheritance rights and related provisions. 1. We're holding our reaffirmation. Matthew leaned slightly forward. We thought. This was already settled. We signed the original will last year. Clara flipped over a page. The original will is still valid. However, Mr. Gregory Carter left behind an addendum, signed on November 12th of last year, duly notarized and explicitly stating a special provision. I opened my bag, took out a USB drive, and plugged it into the projector. The screen behind Clara lit up with an image of Greg, his hair fully silver, eyes tired but still carrying that gentle smile. He looked straight into the lens. If you're watching this, Donna, that means we've reached the moment I hoped would never come. It means they failed the final test. Matthew looked up, his lips moving slightly. Haley froze completely. Gregory W. Carter, hereby state that in the event my son, Matthew Carter, or his wife engages in verbal abuse, physical aggression, or forces my wife, Donna Carter, out of the home we co-own, all of Matthew's inheritance rights shall be immediately revoked. The property shall transfer entirely to Donna Carter under a protective trust. Greg paused in the video, then emphasized, "This isn't because I don't trust my son. It's because I will not allow my wife to become invisible once I'm no longer here to stand by her." I shut off the video. The room's air grew dense. Clara continued, "Body cam audio from Mrs. Donna Carter has confirmed that she was verbally abused and forced out of the home. The content has been reviewed and legally archived. Additionally, Glenbrook Bank has confirmed the property has been transferred in accordance with the clause." Matthew stammered, I didn't even know about this trust clause. Dad never told me." I looked at my son, my gaze steady. Not angry, but not soft either. "Your father believed you would never force me to use this," I said gently but firmly. "But you left me standing outside in the dead of winter." Haley clenched her hands. "This is all blown out of proportion. It was a misunderstanding. I just wanted to help Mom reorganize the house. She agreed to let me redesign the kitchen and living room. I didn't think she'd see that as disrespect." Clara didn't raise an eyebrow, but her tone grew more serious. Ms. Haley, according to the Vermont State Financial Report, you used the home's listed ownership as collateral for a personal loan of $78,000 for an investment tied to Mr. Wyatt Martin's company. The room went completely still. I looked up at Haley. Her lips had gone pale. No, that's not right. It was a personal loan. I had every right. No, Clara interrupted, flipping to a printed bank statement. The asset used to secure the loan was the house at 4211 Maplewood Drive, co-owned by Mrs. Donna Carter without her legal consent. This action is currently under investigation by the Financial Regulatory Agency. Matthew turned to Haley, visibly unsure how to react. You said it was just a small investment. You told me it was under your name. Haley didn't answer. She looked at me, her eyes wide, filled with a mix of anger and confusion. I didn't look away. I didn't need to win. I just needed them to understand. I was never asleep in my role as a mother. Clara concluded, to summarize, legally, Mrs. Donna Carter now holds full control over all real estate assets formerly under Mr. Gregory Carter. Any transfer, mortgage, or usage requires her written consent. I quietly gathered the documents one by one as if I were reclaiming pieces of my life that I'd once given away. Believing love meant never needing boundaries. I stood and said with calm clarity, I didn't come here to hurt anyone. I came to make one thing clear. I never left that house empty-handed. No one spoke. Matthew looked down. Haley stared at the stack of documents like it might swallow her whole. I left the room. The door closed behind me. No dramatic slam needed. Silence was now my loudest voice. I hadn't even made it out of the building when I heard footsteps rushing behind me. The long, carpeted hallway suddenly felt heavier with each step. Mom, wait. Please. I turned. Matthew stood there, his hair a mess, tie crooked, eyes filled with panic like he'd just woken from a nightmare of his own making. He walked toward me, then collapsed to his knees right there in the hallway, shoulders trembling uncontrollably. Mom, I'm sorry. I messed up. I really messed up. I looked at him. The child I once held in my arms, soothed during fevers, hugged through every childhood fear. And now here he was, kneeling in a public hallway, not because he'd lost the house, but because he realized he wasn't the center of someone else's world anymore. I didn't kneel. I didn't reach out to hug him. I just stood there, my voice steady, as if reading something that had long been carved in stone. I didn't do this to get revenge, not to make anyone suffer. I did it because I watched how you looked at your father like he was an old couch to be dragged out of the way. How Haley called me a freeloader in the very home I helped pay off over 30 years, and how you, Matthew, you turned your back while I was being thrown out with a slap. Mom, I got swept up in it. Haley pressured me. I was scared of losing everything, so his voice cracked. But I never thought you'd go this far. I tilted my head slightly. Go far? No, son. I just went far enough to escape the circle you drew for me, where I was supposed to stand still and sacrifice. He sobbed, hands to the floor, head bowed. A few office staff passed by silently. No one interrupted. I imagined if Greg were alive, he wouldn't have let his son kneel like that. But he also wouldn't have stopped me from standing tall. Haley didn't show up. Maybe she knew the final act had no audience left. I pulled a thin folder from my coat pocket and held it out to Matthew. He looked up, eyes wary. What is this? Transfer papers, I said evenly. I sold the house this morning. Matthew took it, hands shaking as he scanned the lines. Then he looked up, alarmed. You sold the house? To who? You can't. I can, and I already did, I replied without a trace of hesitation. The recipient is the Elder Grace Foundation, a nonprofit supporting elderly women who've been abandoned, thrown out of their homes, or financially cut off by their own families. They're going to turn that house into a transitional shelter and recovery center for women like me. Like so many other mothers. Matthew jumped to his feet like he'd been electrocuted. "Mom, you can't do that. That house. It's all we have left." "How you have left," I emphasized. "You didn't build it. You didn't pay the mortgage. You didn't endure bone-cutting winters when we couldn't afford heat. It was me. And your father. We built it with calloused hands and sleepless nights over an empty bank account." I took a deep breath and continued. "You call it a loss. I call it justice restored for something that was twisted beyond recognition. Do you know who was the first person to ask if I was okay after I got kicked out? A teenage gas station clerk. The same boy I gave cookies to that Christmas 3 years ago. And you? No call. No question. Not a single apology, until you realized the keys were no longer in your hands." Matthew said nothing, his head bowed, hands clenching the papers like he could squeeze out a different outcome. I looked down at him, not with anger anymore, just a deep, quiet weariness. "Greg once told me if our son ever turned away from his conscience, I didn't need to forgive. I just needed to stand up. And I did." "What will you do now?" Matthew asked in a choked voice. "Mom, can you forgive me?" I was silent for a few seconds. Then I answered slowly, "I forgive you. But I won't rescue you. Kindness isn't a lifetime loan. And I no longer have the strength to carry those who keep forgetting who I am." Matthew nodded, tears streaming down his cheeks. "I understand." I turned and walked down the hallway, each step lighter as if I were shedding years of silent burden. I didn't look back. I no longer needed to be seen by anyone to feel real. Because now, I had seen myself, and found a woman who would not surrender. I signed the contract for the lakeside cabin on a spring morning when the snow had just melted and the first blades of grass began stretching through the cold earth. The real estate agent, a middle-aged woman named Carol, looked at me over her reading glasses and smiled as she handed me the pen. "People often ask why someone would buy a house in retirement," she said. "But I think sometimes a woman reaches a certain age when she's not choosing a house to live in anymore. She's choosing a place where she can finally breathe on her own terms." I just nodded, gripping the pen gently as I signed the paper without a single tremble. This wasn't a rushed decision. It had taken me a lifetime to learn to choose myself over pleasing others. And I chose a tiny house by Stillwater Lake. No tall fences, no red carpet on the porch, but the sound of rippling water and deer quietly crossing the yard each morning. The house had just 2 rooms, 1 bedroom, and a combined kitchen-living area. The wooden floor had worn with age, but when I stepped on it barefoot, it felt warm. The windows opened toward the lake, with soft sunlight brushing the pine table where I placed a teapot and a blank notebook. I began writing on a rainy afternoon, not because I had planned to write a memoir, but because in silence, memories started returning, and I didn't want to let them fade again. I placed a small recorder on the table, a device Greg once gave me, the kind nurses use to log patient notes. Now I used it to log pieces of my own life. No chronological order, no edits. I just sat there, holding a warm cup of tea, letting my voice echo in the quiet room. My name is Donna Carter. I lived for 30 years in a house I thought was a home, until my son slapped me and said I no longer belonged there. I didn't cry as I spoke. There were no tears left. Just a steady voice, like sketching a map of a journey I once walked with nothing but my own 2 hands. In the nights that followed, I continued, about growing up in a small town where girls were told to marry well and settle down, about arguing with my father to go to nursing school, about working 12-hour night shifts and still coming home to make breakfast for Greg and Matthew. I even told about the nights I sobbed into a wet towel in the bathroom so no one would see me break. Because I was a mother, and mothers weren't allowed to be tired. I sent the first few recordings to Clara, not for any grand purpose, just because I trusted her. A week later, she called back, her voice thick with emotion. Donna, have you considered sharing these more widely? This isn't just your story. It's the voice of thousands of women who were dismissed, overlooked, asked to sacrifice without ever being asked if they wanted to. I paused a few seconds before answering. I'm not sure anyone would listen, Clara said gently. They will, because they've been you. A few days later, one of Clara's friends, a retired audio engineer, helped polish the sound quality. I chose the name Women Who Were Never Asked for the podcast, because for most of our lives, women like me had lived in homes, at dinner tables, on family vacations, where everything was decided, without anyone ever asking, Mom, do you want this? The first episode went up quietly. No announcement, no promo images, just an 18-minute audio file of me recounting the night Greg placed a bank vault key in my hand. I expected nothing. But 2 days later, my inbox began filling with subject lines. Thank you for speaking for me. I thought I was the only one. Donna, you just narrated my life. One woman wrote that she had lived 35 years with a husband who never used her name, just called her the kid's mom. Another said her daughter had forced her to sign over the house and placed her in a nursing home without goodbye. One message read, I never cried when my husband died, but I cried when you said, I no longer want to be the shadow in my own home. I read every letter as if they were maps to hearts I never knew existed. None of them wanted revenge. They just wanted to be seen, to be asked, to be called by their own names. Once a week, I sat by the cabin window, where morning light stretched across the table, and recorded a new episode. Sometimes I told my stories. Sometimes I read letters. Sometimes I invited them to speak. The grandmothers, the mothers, the wives who had been forgotten. The podcast began to spread. Not loud, not viral, just passed along quietly through small communities. A group of women from different states, sharing by email, writing letters, even mailing cookies, with notes that said, I don't know tech, but my grandkid plays this for me every night, thank you. I didn't reply to every letter, but I read them all. And as I read, I remembered what Greg once told me. Silence isn't surrender. Silence is where the voice gathers strength. Now, I'm no longer silent. And I'm no longer speaking just for myself. I was tidying the kitchen drawer when I heard a knock. Gentle, steady, and somehow very polite. I set the dishcloth down and walked out to the porch. Outside stood a composed man in a charcoal gray coat, holding a dark wooden box and a sealed envelope. Mrs. Donna Carter? Yes, that's me. I'm Samuel Banks, a representative from Glenbrook Bank. I've been instructed to hand-deliver this package to you per Mr. Gregory Carter's special request, exactly 90 days after the funeral. I didn't reach for it right away. Something rose in my chest, stopping me. 3 months. Greg had said he was preparing a few things. I thought it was all in the vault, but apparently not quite. Do I need to sign anything? Just a confirmation of receipt. No one else is allowed to open it. I signed, took the box and envelope, and gently closed the door behind me. I didn't rush to open it. I placed it on the table like something fragile, brewed a fresh pot of tea, and out of habit poured 2 cups. One for me, one for the person who no longer sat across from me. Then I opened the box. First was a small cream-colored envelope, Greg's handwriting neat and steady. Donna, open this first. I carefully broke the seal. Inside was a handwritten letter in blue ink, his penmanship still sharp as if it had been written just yesterday. My dearest Donna, if you're reading this, it means 90 days have passed. I didn't choose that number out of superstition, but because I know after 3 months, the pain doesn't disappear. It simply softens enough so we can face the truth without breaking. I know you'd never consider yourself important. You've always seen yourself as the one behind the scenes, the cleaner, the sacrificer. But I've watched you build an entire life from nothing. You were the spine of this home, the hinge on every decision, the heart that kept us together when no one else wanted to stay. I've had this gift ready for a long time, but I knew if I were still alive, you'd never accept it. That's why I left it in this box. Not as a payment, but as recognition. I paused, my hand resting on the edge of the letter. My eyes suddenly burned. I swallowed hard and kept reading. You once sold your wedding ring to help Matthew open his restaurant, and you never said a word. But I knew, because I was the one who found that ring later in a secondhand shop downtown, and I saved it for another. Custom made, with a message engraved inside. WNF. You were never just a wife. You were the foundation. I broke down crying, not from grief, but because I finally saw myself, fully, through the eyes of the one I loved most. I opened the small dark blue ring box inside. A simple platinum band lay nestled within. No gemstones, no showiness, but on the inside 3 letters were hand-engraved in steady strokes. WNF. I slipped it on. It fit like it had always belonged there. Beneath it was a folder wrapped in soft leather. I opened it and saw the first line, Personal Shares, Carter Engineering LLC. Greg, he had secretly kept a portion of his old company shares from back when he was a project engineer before opening his garage. I thought he'd sold it all. But no, he'd kept a small part. Under my name, reappraised shortly before he passed. And now, officially transferred. There was even a notarized deed of transfer that read, to Donna Carter, for her strength, her silence, and her immeasurable worth. I leaned back in my chair, my hand still resting on the box's lid, sunlight from the window gently spreading across the table. The kitchen remained quiet, but somewhere in that stillness, I could swear I heard a whisper. I didn't need wealth. I didn't need proof that I had tried. But today, as I read his words and touched the small objects he left behind, I realized something. Some things don't need to be announced to the world. They just need to be seen by the one person who mattered. And that, to me, was enough. I wiped my face, sat up straight, and turned on the recorder. Today, I received a gift from the past. Not money, not power, but 3 initials engraved on a ring. WNF. I was never just a wife. I was the foundation. And a foundation, even when unseen, is where every roof anchors its trust. I hit save, labeled the recording, Chapter 9. The box on the 90th day. I sat out on the porch, coffee mug in hand, watching the early morning sunlight scatter across Stillwater Lake like floating shards of glass. No phone ringing, no hurried footsteps down the hall, no one asking what I wanted just to say no to it after. Only the whisper of wind threading through the trees behind the cabin, the gentle scent of damp pine wood, and a silence that wasn't exclusion, but a silence I had finally earned the right to choose. I had just finished recording the final episode of the first season of my podcast. In it, I spoke about quietly folding shirts into a duffel bag after being kicked out of my house, and ended with the moment I opened Greg's wooden box. I used no background music, just my voice, calm and steady, like a grandmother, telling a long-kept story in an old kitchen to the only grandchild who cared to listen. 3 days after the last episode aired, my inbox overflowed. There was a message from a 25-year-old woman in Indiana who said her stepmother kicked her out after her father died, but she never told anyone, afraid they'd say she was ungrateful. There was another from a woman over 80 who had cared for 3 husbands through 2 wars, but ended up having to sell her home because her stepchildren didn't see her as real family. And then there were the nameless notes, simple messages saying, "Thank you for speaking." I read each one, no exception. I printed the letters I wanted to keep and placed them in a small wooden box on the shelf. the same shelf that once held my nursing medals, awards, and old photographs. Now, it held the voices of those who had never been asked. I never imagined that one small microphone, a low voice, and a quiet home could connect me to thousands of strangers. But in the end, what they needed wasn't a perfect voice, just the feeling that they were not alone. One day, I received a package from Oregon. Inside was a worn wool blanket, a handwritten letter, and an old cassette recorder. The sender was an 82-year-old woman named Margaret. She wrote that she didn't use smartphones, but her granddaughter recorded my entire podcast on tape so she could listen every morning while making toast and brewing peppermint tea. At the end of her letter, she wrote, "I think you're the voice we've been waiting decades to hear." I sat there, holding the cassette player, hands trembling, not from emotion, but because I understood. Even though I was no longer young or remarkable, I was finally living a life I never dared imagine, one where I was truly heard. That morning, I recorded a special segment. Not to air, just to keep. My name is Donna Carter. I used to be a wife, a mother, a nurse. I was the one who cleaned up after every party, every tantrum, every forgotten word. But now, I'm the one who tells the story. And I don't tell it to be noticed. I tell it so that those who were once treated as invisible can begin telling their own. I saved the recording in a private folder, labeled it Not Forgotten, Not Silent. I still think of Greg often. On mornings like this, I see sunlight dancing on the lake, like his hand brushing the back of my neck while I cooked breakfast. Sometimes, I catch myself whispering the words he once said, "Donna, you don't have to speak loudly. Just speak at the right time." And now I have. I didn't keep the house. I kept my dignity. I don't need the keys to an old house. I've already opened a door for myself. And maybe, through each letter sent in, each whisper carried through sound waves, I've also opened a different kind of door for so many others like me. Women who once walked quietly along the edges, now sitting down to rewrite their own stories. No permission needed, no validation required. I took a sip of coffee, my fingers lightly tracing the smooth wood of the table. On it sat a photo of Greg, smiling as sunlight streamed through the window. I looked into his eyes, then softly said, not needing to raise my voice, "I'm still here, but I'm not the same woman anymore. If you've made it this far, maybe something inside you has been stirred. A memory, an old wound, or simply the feeling that you've been silent too long in a home that never felt like yours. I want to hear from you. Have you ever felt invisible in your own family? Have you ever given up so much space for others that you forgot what you once wanted for yourself? If so, tell me. The story doesn't have to be perfect. The words don't need to be polished. All that matters is that it's true for you. Because we no longer live in a time where women have to stay silent just to keep the peace under a roof. Sometimes even a quiet voice speaking up is enough to make the whole house take notice. If you saw a part of yourself in any part of the story I just told, leave a message below. I read every one, and it's your stories, your truths, that keep me coming back to this porch, picking up the microphone and recording lives that were never meant to be forgotten. And if you'd like to keep hearing honest, everyday stories that are raw and real, about mothers, grandmothers, about the hidden corners inside seemingly perfect homes, please subscribe to the channel. We still have so much to listen to together. Because family isn't always peaceful, but as long as someone is willing to speak and someone else is willing to listen, hope still lives here.